relationships are complicated things. I think it is too simplistic and reductionist to say, well, there's these two things about relationships, because there's many more than two things about relationships. But two of the things that matter in a relationship, whatever the relationship is, are commitment and affection. Now, affection can look different from one relationship to the next. The context makes a huge difference on what affection looks like. So some people, when they hear affection, they're thinking a couple of things. Number one, they're thinking romantic. Okay, the affection of a relationship is bounded up in romanticism and romantic things, which connects it to sexual, or at the very least, the sensual connection. And in marriage, yes, absolutely. Those things are connected to affection. And yet there is this other aspect of affection that is much broader and more general in its application, which has to do with regard. If not everybody that I have regard for do I have affection for, but everyone that I have affection for, I have regard for. One particular aspect of regard, it's in terms of the depth of the idea of regard, a deeper connection in that area, I don't know what to call it, of regard is respect. Excuse me. When you have affection for someone, you will have respect for them. Now that, I know I'm kind of going in lots of directions with it, but it deserves a broader thought. Affection and respect, which is a layer of depth, at least one layer of depth deeper than simple regard. But respect and affection go together. When those I have affection for, I also have respect for. It's just part of the human dynamic. And I think if we are wise and growing in our maturity, we will, I'm not going to say we're going to leverage that, but I will say this sense of affection, regard, respect, that idea can make our lives richer and fuller in terms of our relationships. So what am I doing with all of that? Well, because Paul offers insight into this relational thing as he writes to Timothy on about a very practical matter in their world of slaves and slaves' relationships with their masters, especially those who have Christian masters. We're in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 2, those who have believing masters should not show them disrespect just because they are fellow believers. And remember, we talked about that. This isn't like, hey, you're no better than me. That's not the point. Instead, they should serve them even better because their masters are dear to them as fellow believers and are devoted to the welfare of their slaves, which being devoted to the welfare of their slaves is one reliable translation. Another would be, believe it or not, that the masters benefit from the service of their slaves. Well, I don't know which is the better one. You can kind of flip a coin, pick it out. But the point is, because we're in this family together, we're brothers and sisters. We're siblings in this family. And because of that, there should be some things involved in this relationship. Oh, things I've talked about a little bit, like commitment. When you're in a healthy family, there's going to be commitment between members of the family. Okay? And there are times when that commitment sustains the relationship of people within this healthy family, especially when affection and regard lag. This is obviously true of marriage. In a marriage, I talk about this all the time in my counseling practice. Commitment and affection. They've got to both be present in a marriage for it to be healthy. Now, when affection lags, commitment has to step up. What happens when commitment lags? This is a thing that happens in our culture more and more and more, and so we can't pretend that, it's just going to be there. No, it's not just going to be there. We have to give attention to our commitment. There's several aspects and components to this. First of all, we have to give attention to our commitments, because it's not just a commitment to that spouse. There is a commitment to God. Didn't I, in the company of God and friends and family and community, didn't I say, until at death we part? Yeah, that's a commitment. Because marriage is not a contract, but a covenant. And the covenant is given strength by the commitment of the people within the covenant. I can go on and on about that, but I think you get the point. Commitment. What if my commitment is lagging? Well, that's when I need to be able, in maturity, to step back, take a look, reach back for a greater amount of commitment or renewed commitment in partnership with God's grace. One of the prayers ought to be, Lord, please put within me a deeper, more imperative, I don't know what, what I'm going for is renew my commitment, God. Okay. All right, commitment. Affection is the other. And in our world, often affection takes the front seat. When my affection runs out, we're done. So the vows would read, until, I'm making this promise to you, until I don't feel like it anymore. Well, okay. For slaves, with regard to the master. Now, this is an interesting thing, that Paul addresses the slave's attitude toward their master, but he seems not to address the master's attitude toward the slave, except by inference. And the inference is at the end of that verse, where their fellow believing slave master will be devoted to the welfare of the slaves. Okay. I guess, my gosh, I've made so much of this, and we don't even have slaves today. I talked about that we do have slaves, not in the same way as in century one, but yeah, there are slaves. And within the church, well, I don't think within the actual family of God there are any slaves any longer in the world that you and I live in, and I'm grateful for that. But is there not a principle there that can be applied over into our experience in the context of our world? I think there are. There are principles there for employees and employers. Now, don't for a minute mistake that we have the same relationship as a slave and a master, because we do not. Well, let me just put it this way. If you find yourself employed in a situation where you are in the same kind of situation as the slave of the first century, you need to buff up your resume and get it out there and find a better job, okay? I'm going on the basis that even if you have a crummy job and you're dissatisfied with what's going on in your career life, and you may feel taken advantage of, and you may very well have been taken advantage of by your employer, you're still not on the same level as a slave and a master in century one. So what's the principle? The principle is you have regard. You have those two things I talked about, commitment and affection. Do I have to have this overwhelmingly deep emotional connection with my boss? No, that's not. But I do need some level of affection. On the very top level, I've got to have regard. I have to think of them not just as this evil empire or emperor. They're a person. Okay, I treat them with regard because they're a person. This is how God loves us. Jesus loved us as individual persons, and so his command was, love one another as I have loved you. So, okay. I mean, the theology is significant, but it's not complex. So now you have regard, and then you have, on a deeper level, respect. This whole idea of respect in relationships is very big, in my opinion, and my experience working with people in human relations. One of the aspects is our world views the principle in this way. What I'm going to do is I will relate to the other people in my life on the basis of my respect for them. What diminishes respect? My experience, my answer to that is disappointment. Now, disappointment can come in many different forms. There is a mild form of disappointment, which is that just didn't happen the way I thought it should. Okay, that's disappointing. I would say, if it's not the worst, it's over easily at the edge of the worst, is betrayal. But between this kind of disappointment and betrayal, there are degrees of disappointment. And when I'm disappointed by another person, it's my natural tendency to reduce my respect for them. And when I reduce my respect for them, what does that do in terms of how I relate to them? Well, it colors it. It will also diminish how I express their value in my life. I know I'm using lots of words to say it, but here's the deal. We're not slaves anymore, thank God. We're employees and employers. And there ought to be this level of mutual respect and even affection between us, because, especially if your boss is a fellow believer, this is challenging. I know it's challenging. I've had this experience. but it doesn't make the principle go away just because it's challenging. Well, okay, time's up. We'll see you next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.